The Whitmore Estate, Martha's Vineyard, a summer morning that would shake New England's elite to its core. Richard Whitmore, hedge fund titan worth $1.2 billion, had orchestrated the most bizarre scene of his life. 5 women from Manhattan's upper crust, a senator's daughter, a neurosurgeon, an heiress, a supermodel, and a Fortune 500 CEO, were lined up in the garden like contestants on a reality show. They were competing to become the new mother to Madison, Richard's 8-year-old daughter who'd lost her mother 6 months ago. But while the 5 women flaunted their Hermès bags and promised trips to Paris, Madison pointed to Rosa, the maid quietly cleaning nearby. "I want her to be my mom." Richard went pale. Rosa was a 32-year-old undocumented immigrant from Guatemala who sent half her paycheck home to her family. But what nobody knew was the secret Rosa carried. She was the only one who knew the truth about how Richard's first wife really died. And Madison had figured it out. The Whitmore Estate sprawled across 20 acres of pristine Martha's Vineyard coastline, a monument to new money, trying to look like old money. That July morning, the manicured garden had been transformed into what looked like a twisted episode of The Bachelor. Richard Whitmore, 43 years of Wall Street dominance condensed into a $15,000 Armani suit, surveyed the scene he'd orchestrated with the cold calculation of a man who treated human relationships like stock portfolios. The 5 women had arrived in their Bentleys and Range Rovers, each convinced victory was already theirs. Charlotte Vanderbilt, daughter of Senator Vanderbilt and widow of a pharmaceutical fortune, wore Oscar de la Renta that cost more than most Americans' annual salary. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Yale's youngest neurosurgery chief, had sculpted her face so perfectly that emotion seemed like an inconvenience. Jessica Rothschild, heiress to a banking empire, at 28 had already divorced twice, doubling her net worth each time. Natasha Petrova, former Victoria's Secret angel turned wellness entrepreneur, moved like every step was a runway. Amanda Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, was already mentally restructuring Richard's portfolio for maximum efficiency. Madison Whitmore watched everything from her bedroom window. 8 years old with her mother, Katherine's green eyes and her father's sharp intelligence, a combination that let her see through adult facades with unnerving clarity. Her mother had died in a sailing accident 6 months ago, circumstances the Coast Guard had ruled tragic but accidental, though the investigation had been closed remarkably quickly. Rosa Morales cleaned the great room windows, trying to remain invisible. 32 years old, she'd crossed the border from Guatemala 10 years ago, a widow herself with a 12-year-old daughter, Elena, still living with her mother in Guatemala City. She'd worked at the estate for 3 years, always silent, always efficient, always present. She'd seen things she wished she could forget, new secrets that weighed on her soul, but she needed this job to survive and keep Elena in school. Richard gathered everyone in the garden with the theatricality of a ringmaster who knew his audience was captive. He explained his game's rules. Each woman would have a week to win Madison's affection. Activities, gifts, promises, everything was permitted. At week's end, Madison would choose her new mother. The prize wasn't just becoming Mrs. Whitmore, but accessing an unimaginable life of luxury and, more importantly, partial control of the Whitmore empire. The 5 women exchanged looks that were daggers wrapped in smiles. The competition had begun before Richard finished speaking. Charlotte immediately promised Madison a thoroughbred horse. Elizabeth offered to convert an entire wing into a personal playground. Jessica spoke of monthly Disney World trips. Natasha mentioned Paris Fashion Week, where Madison would be the guest of honor. Amanda, shrewder, promised to triple Madison's trust fund. Madison listened with an expression her father couldn't read. When the women finished their pitches, the child did something unexpected. She walked over to Rosa, who was collecting empty glasses, and took her hand. The maid startled, trying to pull away, but Madison held firm. In that moment, in the child's eyes, Rosa saw something that terrified her. Madison knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to understand that Rosa was the only one in that house who truly mourned Katherine. Richard's world began tilting on its axis as his daughter stood there, holding the hand of a woman who was supposed to be invisible. The 5 candidates stared in disbelief, their carefully prepared strategies suddenly irrelevant, and Rosa, frozen between her need for invisibility and the child's desperate grip, felt the weight of a secret she'd carried for 6 months, pressing down like the entire Atlantic Ocean. The first week transformed the Whitmore Estate into a circus of excess that would have embarrassed the Gilded Age. The 5 contenders turned each day into a competition of who could impress an 8-year-old with increasingly absurd displays of wealth. Richard watched from his study, convinced his experiment would work, that he'd find the perfect mother for Madison without the tedium of traditional courtship. Charlotte organized a tea party with china that belonged to Jackie Kennedy, and pastries flown in from Paris's finest patisserie. Madison sat politely for 20 minutes before asking if she could go to the kitchen where Rosa was preparing dinner. The senator's daughter sat alone as the child helped the maid make tamales, laughing for the first time in weeks when masa flour dusted her nose. Elizabeth brought Madison to her private surgical suite in Boston, showing her cutting-edge technology and promising she'd always be healthy and beautiful. The child observed the million-dollar equipment with apparent interest, then asked if they could stop at the bodega on the way back. While Elizabeth waited in disgust in the Tesla, Madison bought fruit with the few dollars Rosa had secretly given her, choosing each apple with the care of someone who knows what it means not to have enough. Jessica filled Madison's room with chocolates from Belgium, Switzerland, Japan, confections that cost more than jewelry. The child tasted one politely, then asked if she could take the rest to the homeless shelter in Edgartown. During the drive, she told Jessica how Rosa sent half her wages to Guatemala, how she sometimes saw her eating only rice and beans to save money. Jessica changed the subject, irritated by this reality that didn't fit her golden world. Natasha organized a private fashion show with clothes created specifically for Madison by designers from Milan and Paris. The child wore each outfit without complaint, but when Natasha asked which she preferred, Madison pointed to Rosa's uniform, worn but always clean, and said it was the most beautiful dress because it smelled like home. Amanda, the smartest, tried to win Madison through logic and numbers. She showed investment projections, explained how she'd multiply her inheritance, promised the power that comes with wealth. Madison listened carefully, then asked why Rosa, who worked 14 hours a day, earned in a year what they spent on a handbag. Amanda had no answer. Throughout all this, Rosa maintained her silent routine, cleaning, cooking, organizing. But every evening, when she thought no one was watching, she'd sit in the garden beneath Madison's window and sing softly in Spanish, a lullaby from Guatemala, the same lullaby Katherine had learned from her and sang to Madison. Richard didn't know it, but Katherine and Rosa had been secret friends, united by the loneliness of 2 women trapped in worlds they hadn't chosen. It was during one of these evenings that Madison came down to the garden. Rosa stopped singing, terrified she'd crossed an invisible boundary, but the child sat beside her and rested her head on her shoulder. They said nothing for a long time. Then Madison whispered a question that froze Rosa's blood. "You know what really happened to Mom, don't you?" The silence that followed contained multitudes. Rosa's mind raced through the memories she'd tried to suppress. Katherine's growing fear in her final weeks, the documents she'd been gathering, the phone calls she'd made to lawyers. Katherine had discovered something about Richard's hedge fund, something that went beyond aggressive trading into outright criminality. Insider trading was just the beginning. There was money laundering for cartels, market manipulation that had destroyed thousands of retirement funds, connections to politicians who were bought and sold like commodities. Rosa felt her world collapse with Madison's question. For 3 years, she'd carried a secret that consumed her, And now an 8-year-old had discovered her. She couldn't lie to those green eyes so like Katherine's, but neither could she destroy the innocence still surviving in Madison. The truth was complex and painful. Katherine Whitmore hadn't been the trophy wife everyone assumed. She'd been brilliant, a Harvard MBA who'd given up her career for love. But in recent years, she'd discovered things about the Whitmore empire that terrified her. Money laundering through offshore accounts, connections to drug cartels, trades that destroyed pension funds while Richard celebrated another billion earned. Katherine had gathered evidence, planning to go to the FBI, but first she wanted Madison somewhere safe. Rosa had been her only confidant, the only person in the estate she trusted. The night before the accident, Katherine had given her a flash drive with all the evidence, making her swear that if anything happened, she'd protect Madison. The next day, Katherine's sailboat had capsized in calm waters. An experienced sailor drowned in conditions a child could have managed, but Rosa had seen Richard that morning. She'd seen the mechanic, who'd never come before, leaving at dawn. She'd seen Richard smile when he received the news, a smile he'd immediately replaced with a mask of grief he'd worn for 6 months. Madison listened to Rosa's silence and understood more than the woman could imagine. Children have an instinct for truth that adults lose growing up. She knew her father wasn't the man he pretended to be, knew her mother hadn't died by accident, and knew Rosa was the only person in that house who carried genuine grief for Katherine. Meanwhile, the 5 contenders began showing their true natures. Competition was eroding them, making civilized masks fall. Charlotte had started drinking more than she should, revealing a bitterness that years of privilege hadn't cured. Elizabeth had snapped when Madison accidentally spilled juice on her dress, showing a temper that Botox couldn't hide. Jessica had been caught rifling through Richard's study, looking for financial information she could use to her advantage. Natasha had started openly flirting with Richard in front of Madison, forgetting the goal was to win the child. Amanda had offered Rosa $50,000 to disappear, convinced the maid was competition. Richard observed his experiment's deterioration with growing frustration. None of these women seemed suitable to raise Madison, but he couldn't back down without losing face. He was trapped in the theater he'd created himself. One evening, during a particularly tense dinner where the 5 women traded veiled barbs while Madison pushed food around her plate, something unexpected happened. Rosa was serving the main course when she tripped, spilling sauce on Natasha's dress. The former model exploded in fury that shocked everyone, insulting Rosa with words no child should hear, threatening to have her deported, to destroy her. Madison stood from her chair with a calm that didn't belong to her age. She looked her father in the eyes and said firmly, "I've chosen. I want Rosa to be my mom." The silence was so thick it seemed solid. Richard remained frozen, wine glass halfway to his lips. The 5 women went from shock to indignation in seconds. Rosa dropped the tray she was holding, the crash of shattering porcelain the only sound in the room. Richard was first to recover, his forced laugh attempting to lighten the atmosphere. He told Madison the game was choosing among the 5 ladies, not the help. But Madison didn't laugh. She remained standing, small fists clenched.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Her gaze challenging her father with determination he recognized as his own. The 5 women's protests exploded simultaneously. Charlotte threatened to use her political connections to destroy Richard socially. Elizabeth spoke about how unhealthy it was for a child to attach to servants. Jessica calculated aloud how much Richard would lose in business opportunities. Natasha laughed hysterically, calling it the joke of the century. Amanda, ever pragmatic, suggested Madison needed psychiatric evaluation. Rosa tried to retreat, to disappear into the kitchen, but Madison caught up and took her hand. The maid trembled, knowing this moment would destroy the life she'd built so carefully. Richard stood, his face a mask of controlled rage, and ordered Madison to her room. The child refused. Then Madison did something no one expected. She pulled a small flash drive from her dress pocket and placed it on the table. It was the same drive Katherine had given Rosa, which the maid had hidden in Madison's room, thinking it the safest place. The child had found it months ago and seen everything. Videos of her father meeting cartel members, recordings of conversations about eliminating obstacles, documents proving crimes that would send Richard to prison for life. Madison spoke with the voice of a child forced to grow too fast. She told how she'd seen Rosa cry secretly for her mother, heard her pray in Spanish for Katherine's soul, knew she was the only person in that house who wanted nothing from her except to see her smile. She said she knew what her father had done, knew her mother had been murdered, and if he didn't let her choose Rosa, she'd give that drive to the FBI. Richard went white as a sheet. The 5 women, suddenly aware they were witnessing something far more dangerous than they'd imagined, began backing toward the door. But Richard stopped them. He couldn't let this story leave the estate. Rosa finally spoke, her voice broken with emotion. She told Richard that Katherine had truly loved him, despite everything, that she'd gathered that evidence not to destroy him, but to save him from himself, that she'd wanted him to change, to become the man Madison deserved as a father. But he'd chosen his dirty money over his family, and now his 8-year-old daughter held him in checkmate. The tension in the room was electric. Richard looked at his daughter, so small yet so formidable, and for the first time saw Katherine in her. Not just the features, but the courage, the integrity, the determination to do right, even when it cost everything. And in that moment, he understood he'd lost much more than a wife 6 months ago. He'd lost the chance to be a man his daughter could admire. The hours that followed were the longest in Whitmore Estate history. Richard had confined everyone to the great room. The 5 pretenders terrified of witnessing something they shouldn't have, Rosa holding Madison protectively, and him pacing like a caged animal. The first to crack was Jessica. She confessed to being on the verge of bankruptcy, that marrying Richard was her only hope of saving the family empire. Elizabeth admitted to having gambling debts that would destroy her. Natasha revealed she had compromising photos of Richard with other women, planning to blackmail him after marriage. Charlotte, now drunk, laughed bitterly, saying she'd killed her first husband, making it look like an accident, and Richard would have been the second. Amanda, the most dangerous, admitted she'd already embezzled funds from Richard's companies. Certain marriage would cover her tracks. Richard listened to the confessions with growing disgust. His perfect plan had revealed itself as a trap that attracted only predators. And among them all, Rosa shone as the only honest person, the only one who wanted nothing from him. Madison spoke again, her childish voice cutting through adult lies. She said she'd recorded everything on Rosa's phone, every confession, every admission. She'd learned from her father that information was power, but unlike him, she used it to protect, not destroy. She proposed a deal. The 5 women would leave immediately and forever, forgetting everything they'd seen and heard. In exchange, Madison would destroy the recordings of their confessions. As for her father, he would close all illegal operations, compensate victims anonymously, and accept Rosa not as a wife, but as Madison's legal guardian until she came of age. Rosa protested, saying she couldn't accept such responsibility, that she wasn't worthy, that she was undocumented. But Madison reminded her of a conversation she'd overheard between her and Katherine, where her mother said if anything happened, she wanted Rosa to raise Madison. It was Katherine's last wish, and Madison intended to honor it. Richard looked at his daughter with a mix of pride and terror. At 8 years old, she'd orchestrated a move that would make any strategist envious. But more than that, he saw in her the possibility of redemption. If a child could forgive him enough to want to stay with him, if Rosa could accept staying, despite knowing the truth, perhaps not all was lost. The 5 women immediately accepted the deal, too frightened to do otherwise. One by one, they left the estate, their ambitions destroyed by a child who'd seen through their masks. Amanda was last to go, but first whispered to Richard that he'd underestimated his daughter, and Madison would be a formidable opponent in the business world. When only the three remained, Richard knelt before Madison. For the first time since Katherine died, he truly cried. He asked forgiveness not just for what he'd done to her mother, but for trying to buy love instead of earning it. Madison hugged him because despite everything, he was her father, the only one she had left. Rosa watched the scene with a broken heart. For this shattered family, she now had to help rebuild. She thought of Elena in Guatemala, how she'd explain that she was now responsible for another child. But looking at Madison, she saw the same loneliness she saw in Elena's eyes during their video calls. Perhaps, somehow, fate had united two children who needed each other. Richard stood, wiping his eyes, and made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He would not only legitimize Rosa's status, but bring Elena to America legally. If they were going to be a family, they would be a complete one. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd tried to buy a mother for Madison from among America's elite, and instead, his daughter had chosen an undocumented immigrant who had more love in her heart than all the wealth in Martha's Vineyard. 1 year later, the Whitmore Estate was unrecognizable. Not in appearance, the furniture was the same, paintings still in place, but in atmosphere. The laughter of two girls filled rooms that had been silent too long. Elena, Rosa's 13-year-old daughter, had arrived from Guatemala 6 months earlier, after all legal documents were arranged through Richard's newfound legitimate connections. Integration hadn't been easy. Elena spoke little English, was angry at her mother for years of separation, distrusted Madison, whom she saw as the rich girl who'd stolen her mom. Madison, for her part, didn't know how to relate to an older sister who'd lived such a different life. Rosa built the bridge between them, not with grand gestures but with daily patience. She taught Madison Spanish while Elena learned English. She cooked dishes from both cultures, creating a culinary fusion that became their common language. In the evenings, she told stories of her childhood in Guatemala and of Katherine, creating a shared narrative where both girls had a place. Richard had kept his promise. He'd liquidated all illegal operations, losing hundreds of millions, but gaining something more precious: his daughter's respect. He'd retired from the dirty world of hedge funds and refocused the Whitmore empire on legitimate ventures: renewable energy, affordable housing, education technology. It wasn't easy. There were moments when old associates threatened retaliation, but the determination to be a father Madison could admire sustained him. The relationship between Richard and Rosa remained complex. She was legally Madison's guardian, lived in the estate, managed the house and the girls' education, but she always maintained professional distance, still calling him Mr. Whitmore, despite his insistence on first names. She couldn't forget this man had killed her only friend, even if he was trying to redeem himself. The breakthrough came during the first anniversary of Katherine's death. Richard had always avoided that date, but Rosa insisted on taking the girls to the cemetery. Before Katherine's white marble headstone, each spoke in their own way. Elena, who'd never known her, thanked her for making her mother strong. Madison promised to become a woman she'd be proud of. Rosa asked forgiveness for not being able to save her. Richard spoke last. He knelt on the damp earth, uncaring about his expensive suit, and confessed everything. Every crime, every betrayal, every moment he'd chosen power over love. He promised to spend the rest of his life earning the forgiveness Madison had given him, to become the man Katherine had hoped he'd become. As they returned to the estate, Madison took her father's hand and Rosa's, joining them. She said nothing, but the message was clear. They were a family now. Not perfect, not traditional, but real. A family born from pain and forgiveness, from truth and hope. 6 months later, the estate hosted an event no one would have expected. Not a lavish wedding or high society party, but the inauguration of the Katherine Whitmore Foundation for Immigrant Families. Rosa had proposed it, Richard had funded it, and together they were creating something beautiful from tragedy's ashes. During the inauguration, a reporter asked Madison how she felt having a Guatemalan maid as a mother, instead of one of the rich ladies her father had initially proposed. Madison, now 9 with wisdom beyond her years, replied simply, "I chose love over gold. Rosa taught me that mothers aren't the ones who give you life or buy you things. They're the ones who stay when everything falls apart, who hold your hand in the dark, who teach you that being rich in heart is worth more than all the money in the world." Rosa listened with tears in her eyes, holding Elena's hand as her daughter called her mom again. Richard watched his improvised family and understood that Madison had done much more than choose a mother that day a year ago. She'd saved them all. The last scene New England society remembers from this story is the photo that appeared in the Boston Globe. Richard Whitmore, once ruthless hedge fund king, playing soccer in the garden with his 2 daughters while Rosa set up a picnic on the grass. They didn't look like billionaires or maids, Americans or Guatemalans. They simply looked like a family that had learned love can't be bought, only earned. That forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but can build a future, and that sometimes an 8-year-old's choice can save the souls of all the adults around her. The Whitmore Estate still stands on Martha's Vineyard, but now it rings with laughter in 2 languages, smells of pupusas and clam chowder, and in the garden where 5 rich women failed, the simple love of a maid who became a mother flourishes, not through marriage or adoption, but through the brave choice of a child who saw beyond appearances. And Richard, he learned life's most important lesson. You can buy many things with money, but you can't buy a child's love. That must be earned, one day at a time, one right choice at a time. And sometimes, the poorest people are the richest in what truly matters. Hit like if you believe love is worth more than all the money in the world. Comment with the moment that touched you most. Share with someone who needs to know that family isn't always what you expect. Subscribe for more stories, proving that a child's courage can change everyone's destiny.